onto the agenda. So we'll give an introduction about the permission system, and then we'll get into composing permission sets and talking about the new exclusion of permission sets and permissions, how it works, and give you examples of how to use it. We'll go over the new UI for creating permission sets, talk about the inherent permissions and inherent entitlements properties, and then talk about what's coming next. So I'll hand it off to Jens to talk about the introduction.
All right, so, nope, no clicker, not that one. I will stay here instead. So you probably all know and love the, there it is, the Business Central permission system. You have worked with this for quite a while, but there might be a few things that you didn't know about the permission system. First of all, it is used not just to grant user permissions. At the bottom of it, you have the license for on-premise, the entitlements for the SaaS solution. This is actually to protect the IP owner, that this user should only be allowed to do this if you have actually paid your license, etc. Now, the entitlement is mainly for us because your apps is usually in the free range. Now, in order to perform an operation, you also need to fulfill the constraints of the system. An example there is the read-only access that you can set up where you're now talking to a read-only replica. That is actually implemented inside it through the permission system. So it'll block anything that is not a read-only operation for tables. Then there are the permissions that you know of, that the administrator can set up, and that will be the main topic today. And then on top of this, you can actually also add test permission sets if you want to simulate how this runs when you also have permissions applied, because you can there add an extra permission set on top of it. And since the user needs to have access through all of these layers, then you can add this in the test permissions and simulate any problems that you'll see there. But we are going to focus on the administrator, the one that sets up the permissions and how that can affect you. We've invested quite a bit in permissions over the last few releases. We have moved them to metadata, and now we have also improved how the end user can set up permission sets. So what we're looking to achieve is to spend less time setting up permissions. We can see from telemetry that the permissions pages are opened. They're open for quite a while, then they're closed, then they're opened again. And I don't think it's because people really love to open the permission pages. Well, maybe they do. You tell me. But it actually seems to be a relatively time-consuming task to set this up correctly. The second part is actually understanding what you've set up, because it's not that easy. I'm in the server runtime team, and we very often get the question, oh, the permission system doesn't work. And then we look at it, and in the end, well, it is very, very seldom that it's the permission system that doesn't work. It was just that it had a different effect than the user actually expected. And then what we also want to achieve with this investment in permissions is to reduce the maintenance burden, so that when you upgrade stuff, then you don't have to redo things again. So, how are we going about that? Well, first off, we want to move to well-defined, understandable building blocks, so that our end users, the administrators, they should work with permission sets rather than individual permissions. We shouldn't require them to know about the table structure. They should know about what the user needs to be able to perform. So we need permission sets to explain what it does, and then the administrator grants access to the duties that users need to perform, not the underlying tables, etc. That's one of the goals. Reducing the maintenance burden. Well, when we're upgrading to new versions, you want to automatically get the new required permissions, and I'll get back to why this is a place where we actually very often struggle. And we want to make it easy to distribute permission sets together with your app, with your extensions. And we've also invested in automatically assigning roles to users, etc. Third goal is to make this simpler. If you look at our permission sets, they're huge. They're really big. And you think, why? I just need to log in. Why do I need access to an gazillion tables? I'll get back to why that is and some of the tools that we have created so that we can actually make it simpler and we can remove some of the odd permissions that are needed just because the system might initialize because it's the first time you log in, etc. Now, we still want to retain the flexibility. We actually want that to make it even greater by allowing you to specify the granularity and the abstraction level that you want to work at or where you want your customers to work. All right, let's dig into this. So, composing permission sets. What does composing permission set mean? Well, that actually means building new permission sets by gathering other permission sets. So you compose them together. You know that in permission sets, well, the traditional permission sets, they could contain permissions. You have indirect permissions and direct permissions, and for tables and execute permissions, etc. All nice and good. But the composed permission set can also include other permission sets. So set A includes set B and set C, and hence it includes all the permissions that are in B and C. So in this case, the composed permission set will contain everything that is in either the A permission set or in another permission set. This is actually just saying the same, but it actually also highlights that there is no limit to the hierarchy level. You can nest these as deep as you like. Now, I'm not saying you're doing your users a favor if you make a 38-level deep hierarchy of permission sets. I'm not sure they're going to thank you for that, but you're no longer limited to having user groups permission sets. No, you can have permission set that includes another one, which includes another one, and then you can define the granularity that you need by composing in this way. Now, you might think that this is old news because you could do this already in 2021, Wave 1, in metadata. That was actually the release where we moved the permission sets into metadata so that you could now distribute them together with your app. You could see here that it has included permission sets, but it was cheating a little because actually when it was added to the system, it would just be flattened. So at that point in time, there wasn't really any permission sets inside other permission sets. Now with version 20, which is what you have right now, then actually already version 20 support this having permission sets inside permission sets because the information gets added to a small trio of system tables. You have tenant permission set, which has permissions in it, but then it also has permission set relations, where it can include other permission sets. Now this is being kept at runtime, so the one you saw before, you will now at runtime also be able to see that this permission set includes this other one, so at runtime there's also a hierarchy that is retained. So let's see how we define a composed permission set in the UI. And this is where Darrick is more of the expert.
Yeah. Okay, so it's a little hard to see, but the basics is basically the top left. I mean, you can see the permission set name as you could before, but it also gives you the type. Now in the middle section, it's a list where you can include and exclude your permissions. And this is, so those are for permissions, I mean, table data, your page, so on and so forth. In the bottom left, now this section is the one that's really new, where you can include permission sets. This is also where you will be excluding, and we'll talk about that later. And on the split view, so on the right side is where you would see the result of your permission sets and the hierarchical structure that actually is there. So for example, in here where I have D365 read included, it does show me that I have D365 included, and I mean, my inclusion status is full, meaning that I have everything included. We'll get into that a little later. And on the right side, we have a fact box, and this one specifically shows you the permissions that are added into the selected permission sets. And now, how do you see like the result of this whole composition? after you've created your permission set with all the inclusions and exclusions. We have a new table called expanded permissions. And if I just go back one slide real quick, in the top left, we have an action view all permissions. And this opens the expanded permissions page and will show you a flattened list of all the permissions that is the result from your permission set.
Yes, and we're going to see this live in the product in a moment. So what are the benefits for you here? Well, the benefit is that you can create hierarchies. You can create something that works for your line of business. You can compose these permission sets. You can ship them as separate extensions or apps if you would so like. So you decide. And just as a sample, you could decide to have a structure where you have roles, duties, and tasks. So you have the bigger role on top, which includes all the duties that you expect this role to fulfill. And in order to do this duty, this user needs to have access to these tasks. And then underneath the task, you will actually have the actual permissions. This is something that we at least believe users will have an easier time to relate to, because this is something they're giving access to what the user needs to do. And now, this is all nice and good. Now we're going to talk about exclusion. It's very weird that we actually like to we normally like to talk about inclusion and inclusive behaviors, but just in this case, we'll talk a little about the benefits of exclusion. And be aware, we will go into excruciating detail about what it means. Sometimes the permission sets aren't right for you. They are not fine-grained enough. They might include too many permissions. You don't agree with Microsoft or your partner's definition of what a sales order clerk should be able to do. So you want to remove something. In previous versions, what you would have done is copy a permission set. Unfortunately, this means that now it's up to you. When we upgrade, then if Microsoft added a new permission to that permission set because a sales order clerk now needs that, then you had to do it. And you wouldn't really figure it out until the customer would call you and say, I can no longer do task A. So this is actually one of the most frequent problems we could see happening out there. So we wanted to see if we could solve this. And what we've come up with is the ability to, now this might sound odd, to add excluded permissions. So you're adding something that excludes something. So we actually added this in 2022, Wave 1, the ability to exclude permissions. How many of you have made use of it so far? I'm actually happy to hear that. Because I'll get back to in a moment that we had to change the behavior a little bit. So I'm happy if it doesn't because there are some odd cases where it may not work as you would expect. But the tenant permission table has a new field called type. So when you add permissions, well, if you change the type to exclude, now suddenly you're subtracting permissions instead. So for instance, in this example here, you have the D365 Basic, the HR Edit, full access, and then in the employee permission set, you exclude the permissions to modify and delete for the table data HR confidential command line. Now, this user, if this is the permission set that you assign to the employee, that employee can no longer modify and delete from this table. Now, you can do the same with permission sets. Just like the permissions had a type, then the relation between the permissions also has a type. You can see that in small, inconspicuous little red arrow over there that points to the type, which can either be include or exclude. Include is the default, but you can also exclude a permission set. So how does this work? So, warning. This is math. It is set theory. So what we do is that when you have a permission set that includes others, then in this case you have the P top permission set, and that includes permission sets P1 and P2, and then some explicit permissions PEX. And then it excludes permission set O1, and it excludes explicit permissions, OEX, the explicit ones. Now, in set theory notation, we will do the union of all the included permission sets and their permissions. And then we're going to do the complement, and then on the other side, we'll do the union of all the things we should exclude. And then we'll take the complement between these two, which in normal words is we subtract. Think of this as subtract just in a set theory manner. And then the visual representation here is you had the blue ones representing what you had included, and then you excluded the white ones, and what you have left is basically what's left of the blue ones. An easier way, maybe, to think of this is that what we do, now, we've optimized it a little behind the scene, but we calculate the expanded list. We just calculate the sum of everything that's included as a list of permissions. Put that to one side. Then we calculate the list of everything that you have excluded. Put that to a side. Now I have two lists, and now I take, well, for every element over here, I look up in the excluded list. Should I exclude it? If I should exclude it, then I take it out. And then you end up with that list. So of course, if you exclude something that is not in the included list, it has no effect, because you can't exclude something that wasn't there already. So this is how it works. This is if you had managed to code around, because the system tables were there in version 20, and if you had coded this, you could have added exclusions to permission sets, but we actually realized that it didn't work the way we wanted it to do, because it was effectively implemented as a skip. So if you excluded a permission set, then we would skip it during the calculation. But that is not the same as removing them at the end, because if you restructured your permission set, then the permission set that you excluded may no longer be in the tree anymore. And then suddenly you had this dependency on how we'd internally define it. But we're going to go painstakingly through some examples. But now, with this change, then we have just said that it works exactly as I explained before. You can do this in two ways. You can do this in metadata. So you had the included permission sets. Now you have a new thing, new kid in town, excluded permission sets. And then you can also specify permissions. And you might look at where is the excluded permissions. It's not there. And I don't think we will add it, because you can just create a small permission set with what you want to exclude, and then exclude that as a permission set, which also, that's actually how we want to group things together so you don't have as granular things. So unless there's a big pushback, then we're probably just going to leave it with the excluded permission sets. You can also do this in the UI. And now I think it's time to talk about that and how you do that.
So instead of showing it to you there, I'll show it to you in the product.
Excellent choice. Excellent choice.
Showing, yep. All right. So I have a BC TechDays permission set. So you can see I have D365 read and email admin included. So let me edit that. Let me take out email edit. So change that from include to exclude. And now you can see on the right side that is my inclusion status have suddenly become partial. And if I look into email edit, email admin, it actually includes email edit, and now the inclusion status is actually excluded. So none of those permissions are going to be, you won't see them in the expanded permissions. So if you can actually, this is a whole tree, and it will go down all the way, and you can take a look. So for example, here, like email edit is there as well, and it's excluded. So
can you just leave that on there?
Yeah.
Now, if you look at this, you might be a little surprised, because yeah, of course the email edit is excluded. But what about this language edit, which is now stated as only partially there? What's gone wrong here? That's actually, well, is that what I wanted?
Yes. So, in this case, system application edit. It includes email edit, and it includes queues and KPIs, data classification, so on and so forth. Now, because system application edit loses the permissions from email edit, it shows that it's partial because it's still including some other stuff, but it's now lost those permissions that it was initially including.
Yes. So now we're actually going to do a little trick, or a little quiz. You can call it not a trick, a quiz. There is no scoring, etc. But I would recommend that you try and follow me along the way and just see if you understand what this exclusion actually means. So we have an example, relatively simple example, where you have these permission sets, D, C, B, and A. The permission set A includes permissions 3 and 5. Permission set B includes permissions 4 and 5. And as you can probably guess, if you look at it, what's in D? Well, that's permissions 3, 4, and 5. Since it's just sets, then it's not that there are 2 instances of permission 5. No, it's just permission 5 is there. So this is our base example. What we're going to do now is see what happens when we start excluding from this. And then you can, whenever I'll just show examples, then you can think, so what would you think? And then, of course, you'll get the answer right after. So start very simple. What would happen when we exclude permission 3? What would you expect there to be? Permission 3, 4, 5, or permissions 4 and 5? Not the hardest exercise, right? But we need to start a little easy. Yep, it'll contain permissions 4 and 5 because the original list was 3, 4, 5. And then the exclusion list was 3. Take that out, so we have 4 and 5 left. Easy peasy, right? What's so hard about this? So now we have a new one that includes D and excludes permission 5. What would you expect here? 3, 4, 5, or only 3, 4? Because you did notice that permission 5 was there twice. Give it a little thought. Think about how this could be, and then, well, you have permission 3 and 4 left because you had the list of 3, 4, 5. Now we remove 5, so you have 3 and 4 left. So far, so good. So as long as we're talking about individual permissions, this is easy. Now we come to the permission sets. Now G, no, we're not excluding the permission sets yet. Now we have G that includes D and excludes C. Sorry, yes. So you have the G has the D and then it excludes C. So what's left at this point in time? Is it empty? Or because C is actually empty, it just has other permission sets inside. So what do you have? Do you have the empty set at the end? Or do you have permissions 3, 4, and 5? Well, the answer is it's empty. Because since G excluded C, then it excluded the list of permissions that are inside C, meaning that it excludes 3, 4, and 5, meaning there's nothing left. Now we have that the new permission set H includes D and it excludes B. So if we had just skipped, no, I won't. So what do you expect here? Do you expect it to be empty? Do you expect it to just have permission 3? Or would you expect it to have permission 3 and 5? Yes, it's 3. And this is actually the difference between skipping and excluding. Because if we just skipped B when we calculated it, then you would have had 3 and 5 left. But since we're doing it in the math notation we talked about earlier, then you'll end up with permission 3. I just have 1 or 2 more. So now we have a new permission set I, which includes D, just like before. And now it excludes Q, and Q includes A and B. So what do you get now? Empty, permission 3, 4, 5, or do you get an error? Well, you get the empty. Because first we take all the ones that are included, 3, 4, 5. Then we need to take everything that's excluded. Now we need to calculate the full queue. Q includes A and B, which means that's also 3, 4, 5. So subtract those from each other, and now it's empty. And I think this is the last example. No, second last. And now you have J, that includes D, like before, and then it excludes R, and R includes A and B and excludes P5. So now you're excluding a permission set that itself excludes something. So what would you expect? To be empty or permission 5? Well, it'll be permission 5, because if you calculate R, then R is 3, 4, 5, and then exclude 5, meaning that R is 3 and 4. When you exclude that from 3, 4, 5, you have 5 left. And then the small one here, what if you then have D1? If D had been a little bit different, and it included both C and then B again, would it make any difference? No, it would not. It is just the same. It doesn't matter if you include something multiple times. It doesn't count more. It's not like a voting system that, oh, I've been included 4 times, but I've only been excluded twice, so I'm there twice still. No, that's not the way it works. By the way, another thing that doesn't come clear here is it is not a deny permission. It does not mean you can't get this permission from another permission set. It just means that in this permission set where I've had these and then I exclude this, it's no longer inside this. But it doesn't deny you from getting it somewhere else. Because the problem with the deny is it's very counterintuitive that by assigning an extra permission set to a user, he could suddenly do less, because that one contained a deny permission. So it is not a deny. The whole idea is it does not matter how the permission set is structured internally. Whether in all of these examples, I'll just take this one again. If we had defined D as just being permission 3, 4, and 5, not including anything else, just permission 3, 4, and 5, you would have gotten exactly the same results. It does not matter how it's internally structured. Let's take a look at creating some.
Yep.
I'm sorry for going through all of these details, but there is this surprise that, well, I exclude a permission set, and then I actually exclude all of the permissions that are in there, and not just not calculate it in. But let's see some examples.
Yep. So I'll go over some of the examples Jens went through, but show you through the UI. So firstly, I have permission set A, as Jens had mentioned. I mean, it includes permission 3 and 5. Just quickly to show you the expanded permissions, this is how it looks like. So 3 and 5. And permission set B, I have included 4 and 5, as you can see. And then in C, I have included permission sets A and B. So in this one, I will get the result of 3, 4, and 5. So now, with the very first example, I'm just going to include D. And I'm sure all of you can imagine already, it's going to, oops, nope, permission C. Permission set C. And the result will be 3, 4, and 5. But let's go on to excluding more stuff. So I'll go to permission set E. Let me edit this. Let me include permission set D. And then exclude permission 3. Now, as Jens had shown us, this will actually give us permissions 4 and 5. So when we open up the expanded permissions, it will calculate it and give us that result. And then if we go to permission set F, now let's include D again. And let's exclude C. So we know D includes C, and if we exclude C here, what we'll expect is that it actually shows us the inclusion status is excluded because all the permissions have been removed, and if we expand it, there are no permissions in this permission set. So simple enough. And one more, permission set H. Now I am going to include A and B here. Permission set A and permission set B. And then I am going to go back and go into permission set I. And here is where I am going to include D, but exclude H. Let me change that to exclude. So similarly, now because I'm like the one from before, I am excluding D, which includes A and B, and then I'm including A and B, and then H is the one that is excluding the permissions. So that is how it looks for the from the UI, playing around with the inclusion and exclusions for this. Yeah, so excluding permissions, some considerations to take note of. So I mean, you can really surgically choose what permissions you want to remove from your final permission set. So I mean, excluding existing permission sets will often exclude too much. For example, if you take like D365 Premium and you want to take away, I don't know, D365 read, you're basically taking read away from almost everything. And then what you should do is kind of create small permission sets with the ones that you really want to exclude. Like Ian alluded to earlier, I mean, you want to pick the permissions that you really want to take out and then put that into a permission set and then exclude that one permission set. The permission set owner.
Yeah, this is actually me. Yes,
Yeah.
so you might want to look to us if we're excluding permission sets inside permission sets when we ship something, but since we're the original owner, then in general, we're just going to include stuff. The exclude is mainly there for tweaking what somebody else was shipping. In the end, it doesn't matter, because the internal representation doesn't matter, but if you're the permission set owner, you would normally just include permission set. And this also works best with small permission sets, because remember that it might take 15 permissions to allow somebody to edit something, but it only takes one to take that ability away, because he needs access to all of them, so you can just take one away. So you can surgically remove the ability to do things. Let's see how this works with the copy permission set, etc., and how this can solve the problem that we talked about earlier with copying permission set and keeping it updated.
All right, so let's go back to the product. Okay, so the copy permission set action, still the same, it's up there. But now there's a slight difference. Now you have the copy operation. So the one that all of you know is basically a flat copy. So if I did this flat copy now, I would just call this basic flat. Very quickly, you guys can imagine it would just give me a whole flat list of permissions within the permission set. Maybe I shouldn't have chosen basic. Bad choice for a demo right now. Cancel. Okay, let me choose something else to show the others. Okay, but you guys know what the flattened copy is. And then there is copy by reference, and this is the default that we would like you to actually use. So reference copy. And what happens with this one is actually it, let's select that, yeah. So it basically just includes that permission set that you had just chosen. So I know a lot of your customers use custom permission sets, and sometimes you take basically like a D365 basic, for example, and build on top of that and take stuff out. But you don't get the stuff that we add in the future. However, now, if you do this copy by reference, you would include our stuff whenever we also make changes, but you can also then add the stuff that you want to exclude from D365 basic, for example. And there is one more. Let me just select this one again. Copy permission sets, and which is basically clone. Clone copy. And as the name kind of suggests, it does an exact clone of the permission set. So all the inclusions and that you get. Wait, did this one not have? Ah, okay. I should just pick another one real quick. Exact maybe. Nope. I am sorry, I need to find receivables. Yes, this one. Okay. Let's make a quick copy of this. Clone it. Clone 2. Yes. And then if we open this, you can see I get all the permissions that I had originally included in that permission set and all the permission sets that were included as well. So this is another way to do that. Now if I go back to the slides. So yeah. So as I had mentioned, now this is a quick recap. So with reference, it basically includes the selected permission set in your new permission set. The flat list is what all of you already know. It's the old behavior. It just flattens the whole permission set and does a copy.
And actually what we're trying to say is, don't do that.
Yes. And then clone is basically just taking cloning it exact with all the permissions and permission sets, whether it's included from the original. And then what I want to just quickly go over is that, I mean, these permission sets can also be exported into XML. So this is the old way that I'm sure some of you, or if not all of you, work with. There's some slightly new changes where the permission set relation is also now included. And there's a slight tag, version 2.0. It's just such that you can actually still use your old XMLs to be imported. And it's still one action. You don't have to specify, hey, include new one or old one. It's read from the version. So this is for the system permission set. And then there's also the tenant permission set. But one slight difference between the tenant and the system permission set being exported is that there is a related scope. It's just so that we know if it's being taken from a system permission set or not. And off to Jens for inherent permissions.
Yes. So I mentioned earlier that we also want to simplify the permission sets. And one of the tools which has been there since version 20, but it was only there for on-prem scope. That is now available also for cloud scope, so we're going to repeat it here. This is inherent permission, which is an ability to elevate user permissions in this particular scope, actually within this particular method. If you do that, then it is granted during the specific method execution, and you no longer need to add this permission to the permission set. This allows us to get more clean and comprehensible permission sets because all of these odd permissions can now be removed. It should be noted, you cannot change the permission setup of other extensions. You can only do this for your own objects. So if you need to read your own setup table, then you can say, well, I want to make sure that whatever user runs this code, it can actually read the setup table. Then you can have this inherent permissions there. The syntax is an attribute on the method, and you'll see an example there, but I just want to highlight at the bottom, there's an inherent permission scope, because as I mentioned before, we both have permissions and entitlements. By default, this will, when you add this attribute, it will give you both permissions and entitlements. I know that you don't need to worry so much about entitlements, but it's just for information. It is there. It can either be set to both permissions only or entitlement only. The example that we have is actually we used to require general ledger entry indirect read permissions in order to log in. And that's because if we're in the demo setup, then it needs to figure out a default work date. And it does that by taking the latest entry in the general ledger entry. It's not that we're giving the user access to general ledger, but it would fail if you didn't have it. So that's why there was this odd indirect permission. Now we've just attributed this code, and now this will always succeed regardless of which user is running it. So this user no longer needs to get indirect permissions assigned to general ledger entry. The scope of inherent permissions follows down the stack. So if you put it on the top, then you call other methods. Then you still have this inherent permissions. But if an event gets raised, we strip those inherent permissions away, because you could not know when you called this code whether there would be an event subscriber later. You don't want that code to run with elevated permissions. So it's only for your own permissions. It's only for your own call stack. Event subscribers can't do it. Now, of course, if you are the event subscriber yourself, then you can attribute the event subscriber with inherent permissions, and now we're back in the game, right? So this allows you to take away some of these and also make the code more stable, particularly for initialization or is my feature enabled and stuff like that. So when should you use this? Well, first of all, you should use this for small, dedicated tasks. You shouldn't be running large processes with inherent permissions. That's not what is there. You're not meant to circumvent the security system. But why should you require read writes just to see whether this feature was enabled, for instance? So small, dedicated tasks, ideally methods that don't call other methods, just to keep it simple. You'll probably limit this to critical code paths where you never want this to fail, regardless of the user. I think where we have mainly used this are for system tasks. For instance, first time somebody logs in and we need to initialize some tables. Well, it's really sad to have to give write access for a user, just because you don't know which user will be the first one who goes into that, and you don't want to initialize it. You can run this with inherent permissions. Now you no longer need to set this up in the permission set. But you also have to think that you're taking away the administrator, or Stan as we call him, the business owner. You're taking away his ability to remove this right again. Because you're saying, this code will always just give the user this permission within this method scope. We've added more to the permission story. We've added isolated events, and we've added stuff to how we deal with entitlements, etc. But these are the things that we wanted to highlight to you because they are the most relevant to you to know about. And sorry for dragging you through so deeply about the excluded permissions, but we want you to understand how it actually works. So let's wrap this up. So we wanted to create well-defined, understandable building blocks. And what we have delivered there to help this is the ability to have these hierarchical permission sets and a UI that actually lets you navigate the tree and see the results of doing this. That's actually also to the part I said earlier, understand what you do. We want to reduce the maintenance burden. That's mainly regarding this copying permission set, etc., where you should stop copying flat permission sets, copy by reference instead. If you remember one thing from this session, and that's it, that's good enough for me. To simplify permission sets, we have added the inherent permissions attribute. And then for flexibility, we have added the ability to exclude permissions and permission sets. And remember, this also gives you the opportunity to basically create an app which contains permission sets for your line of business. And even if it doesn't completely match a user's needs, then they can still surgically remove what they didn't agree with. And with that, we just want to talk about, we're almost done with what we want to do with permission sets, but there are still some things to do.
Yes. So, we want to further componentize the permission sets that we already have. All of you know, D365 Basic, Premium, all that, includes a lot of stuff. We want to chop that down to bite size, as in the keynote, Bugsy mentioned, Peter mentioned that we wanted to be by like scenarios and all that.
Yeah, and we're also gonna introduce the inherent permissions on object, which is basically you take away the opportunity to set up security on this object. That should be used sparingly, but for instance, set up tables, and there are others where it just doesn't make sense that you should ever be able to set it up.
Yeah. And then we want to improve troubleshooting tools and have new tools for you. For example, if you wanted to find with like the GL entry, for example, that which permission set is actually granting that permission.
And then we're going to add even further to telemetry and to auditing capabilities. We already have telemetry when permission sets gets added to users, removed from users, etc., so that when the customer calls and tells you, as of Friday, I can no longer do blah, then you can actually go in telemetry or in your audit log and say, oh, well, that's probably because the administrator did this, and then you can actually fix the problem. And, damn, we only have 1 or 2 minutes.
Yeah. Does anyone have questions?
There's a question there in the...
Do we use this?
We can try.
I don't know. Test?
Yep.
Okay, dude, why don't you tell me and then I'll repeat it.
Yep.
When you have a table saying read, yes, and no for others,
Okay.
it's only the yes that excludes from the original table.
Yes, so